Welcome back to Spinning the Past. Today is another episode from this book, Spain's Golden Fleece. I love the book so much that I returned the library copy and I bought my own. There's so much in here I want to be able to read. I want to take notes. I just want a lot more time than the library will give me. So today's chapter is on shearing the flocks. Last time I talked about washing the fleeces. This is the chapter prior to it. This is chapter 7. And I wanted to do that washing one because I know a lot of people are washing fleeces for shave them to save them. So I wanted to give them an introduction to how the Spaniards wash their merino fleeces. But now we're going to go back to shearing. And I want to read this quote. This is Letter to Peter Collinson. It is 1764. They begin to shear the 1st of May, provided the weather be fair. For if the wool were not quite dry, the fleeces which are close piled upon one another would ferment and rot. It is for this reason that the shearing houses are so spacious. I saw some which can contain in bad weather 20,000 sheep and cost above 5,000 pounds sterling. So a lot of these, because Spain was so used to having to process so many large flocks, and flocks were around 10,000 sheep on average, more or less up to 40,000, some about 1,000. That they just had this industry that developed over centuries on how to efficiently process their fleeces. And we're talking about merino. Merino originally came from Spain. So the year of that when they would shear them was between April and June, and it really depended on which part of the country, what the weather conditions were like, when the shears, everything had to be in order. The shearing houses, and I'm going to call them shearing houses, I'm not going to butcher the Spanish here, were 400 to 600 square feet. So pretty. And they would hire about 300 shearers. 300 shearers. So if you're going to have 300 shearers, that means you have a lot of fleece you need to go through. The storerooms could contain 100 to 120,000 fleeces, and there were about 12,000 corrals 12,000 sheep in the corrals. So they would first get the sheep that the batch, let's say call them a batch, okay? Like the first batch was going to come in. So the night before they would enclose them, and they called it a sweating room. So they would put the animals, and the animals would kind of sweat because it was hot overnight, and then they would start shearing them the next day. The reason for that, it would melt the lanolin a little bit, and then make the blades, the shearing blades, go easier and quicker into getting that fleece off the sheep. There was lots of prep that had to go in. Like there were the chief of the shearers, and they had to have sub shearers, and then all the other people were around it, people who were doing even a little bit of meal prep, the women who were picking up the stuff, the young boys running around doing stuff. So it took quite a lot of people to do this. The length of time that let's say a giant flock would be sheared would probably take about a whole month. That's the whole process. Their days were about 12 hours long, somewhere between 5 a.m. to 6 p.m. So they were really long days. Like I said, the flocks were led into the corrals. The lambs were separated. Their fleeces were treated separate. They also did a last pre-check of the sheep. The adults, like I said, were put into what they call a sweating room. The lambs were not sweated. And the rams were not tied. So they may tie up a ewe or something to do her, but the rams, of course, we know rams rambunctious, very strong, very susceptible to anger and stress. They called it beguile the rams out of the fleece. So they would treat them nice and gentle and no stress for the rams, and that helped them get the fleece off a ram. So the lead, like I said, there was a lead shearer plus locals who were hired temporarily. Remember, this is in the kind of in the summertime. The crops have already been planted. There is no harvest, so the people who were there local who didn't have an income, they could do this to supplement their income. The shearing blades were about 1 foot long, so pretty long blades. So how long would it take to shear a single sheep? So the book goes over, about 10 minutes, but that would be if the shearers were being cocky, and they would often maybe injure the animal, stick it in, and getting the animal to bleed and that kind of stuff would cause a lot of stress, open them up to disease, open them up to maybe even die. So that was not the preferred method. So they would do about 10 to 12 sheep per day, and about or 8 rams or wethers. So wethers are castrated males. They would do about 35 to 40,000 sheep in a month. That's a lot of sheep. Okay. It says in here, one of the quotes here, an English shearer could do 60 in a day. So the English are saying, hey, we could do up to 60 a day. But these are not Merinos, they said. Even after English required the Merinos, they couldn't shear any quicker. So if you read in English sources how fast the shearers could do their sheep, those sheep are not as densely wooled as the Merinos. And when the English got Merinos and they started to shear them, they found out, oh golly gee, the Spaniards, it takes a lot longer to shear these Merinos. Once the fleece is shorn, it was collected and bundled. Sometimes the separation of the fleece would take place at that time. Sometimes it would take place later. So you remember that not all parts of the fleece are equivalent. Belly wool, leg wool, all these are kind of different grades. I think I said this, for every 35 to 40,000 sheep, they would hire about 280 to 300 shearers. Like I said, there were carriers to the storeroom, so once they would bundle up the fleeces once they're shorn, and they would carry them to a storeroom. And the storeroom would be literally from floor to ceiling packed with shorn fleeces. Remember, the fleeces are not washed prior to shearing. This is a little different than the English method, which they either put the sheep in water or something to get them a little bit clean before they sheared them. The Merinos, they were too dense. They would chill. When you stored them, they would rot, as I read. So these would be what called dry, but they would be sweated out a little bit because, like I said, the sheep kind of were steamed, if you will. They went to like these steaming rooms to. And when you have lanolin and you're doing shearing, it lubricates the shears. That lanolin lubricates it, so it makes it easier, a better cut, cleaner cut. Then you have less ability to have nicks and that kind of stuff. So I said that women were involved, sweeping and gathering bits. Every part of the wool was kept, even the little sorts that they wouldn't use. The wool was used for something. They may not go into the market, but every little bit was saved. The boys would bring around charcoal as like sticks. Like if there was a wound, they would put it on it so maggots wouldn't get in there. And there's plenty of wine to go around, so everybody was happy shearing. The fleeces and the pelts from the dead sheep from prior to this could be harvested for the wool. The hides would be soaked and draped, and then the wool scraped off. Lamb's wool, which I found was interesting, was treated separately. So those were short fibers that made them unsuitable for the finest yarns. And the lamb's wools are kept separate. And I find that really interesting because I don't know, we've gotten into this thing, oh, lamb's wool, it's the best, it's the softest, is that, but that's not what they're saying, that the lamb's wool doesn't actually make, because the fibers are short. So short fibers, when you twist them, can poke out, they can kind of untwist, and then they get prickly and they can poke out. So those are not considered the finest. So after the shearing, there could be a lot of stress, and the shepherds knew that. Each sheep was examined carefully. The older sheep were separated out for meat. So they would tell by their teeth and everything if they were about 8 years old or older, or they just knew that the sheep were doing poorly. Those sheep would be culled. The remaining stock would be counted again because they kept really good records on how many sheep they had. They would be enclosed indoors if it was bad weather, because the shorn sheep were susceptible to chills, especially Merinos. Or they would be corralled outside, and they would be kept in these pens and these corrals for about 2 weeks. They wouldn't continue their journey. Remember, this is just kind of a stop off before they went to their into their summer feeding grounds. The shepherds knew, let's let the sheep acclimate, let's get them strong, let's, make sure all the sheep are doing okay. It takes a whole month anyway, so let's just let the sheep chill, and then we can all go on our merry way on the next stage. So shearing marked the end of wool production. This is very important. Washing marked the beginning of the wool marketing production. So actually this chapter is the end of wool production. And wool production to them means that from birth until the shearing. And then afterwards, it gets out of the shepherd's purview then. Once the wool is kind of sold or it's going to market, it's going to be washed. The next chapter we talked about washing. That was out of the, so those are different people who are in charge of that. So up to this point, they consider this part of the wool production, and the washing part is the wool marketing. So shepherds out there may want to, consider how the Spaniards divided up wool production versus wool marketing. Small shepherds we have here, those may be all intertwined, but just a little fact for you. The wool fleeces were stuffed in giant burlap bags and then weighed. Now, I think in the other chapter it said, I think it was like a ton, somewhere around a ton in those bags, but they would be weighed. And from those bags, they would be put on carts, and then they would go to the next place, maybe 7-10 miles away, to be washed. And I talked about that already. The royal, I guess the people who were in charge of buying the wool for the royal houses came, and they selected and they weighed, and they made sure they were weighed properly, and they chose the finest wool. So the sorters, how we have wool graders even now, was a 4-year apprenticeship. They would, and I just found this a little bit interesting, maybe you'll find this boring, but how they trained their wool sorters. So it would unfold the fleece on like a grid work. So like some sort of chicken wire thing, something that has where the wool can fall through the bottom. The fourth quality wool was the stuff that fell down to the ground. It was the legs, it was the belly, that it wasn't even counted as part of wool production. It went to other things, but it really went out. It wasn't even worthy to be sorted. So the sorter tore from the loins, the inferior wools, so that was what we call skirting now, and grabbed with both hands fistfuls of wool and divide it into 3 piles. The finest, which is the sides of the neck and the back. Second was rump, upper thighs, sides of the body. and they said belly. I'm not quite sure why the belly, because we consider that kind of fourth sort wool. The third sort was the lower shoulders and the thighs and the rump to the tail. Lamb's wool was not sorted. It was sold as is, unwashed, and just by weight. Now, when one Englishman saw this, the Spanish method, he called it lazy and artless. But you have to remember that Merino sheep have 75% to 90% uniformity of the fleece, and that's prime fleece. The English breeds could have up to 15 grades of wool within a single fleece. That's what makes even today the Merino so special, that there's so much uniformity, so there wasn't that much sorting to be done. John Lubbock, who's also an Englishman, who disagreed with the other one who called it lazy and artless, John says that the Spanish method requires much greater dexterity than in readily conceived by those who have only seen it perform. So he's kind of mocking the other guy. You only saw it perform, but if you had to do it yourself, there's a lot more that goes into this. So stop being dismissive of the Spanish way of sorting fleece. The average weight of the Merino fleeces were about 5 pounds, about 2 kilograms. And I'm pretty sure that the rams weighed more. And if you compare it now, a Merino fleece now that I buy is 7 to 9 pounds. So much more fleece. Maybe they have, they've probably improved the breed. So they're bigger bodies, there's more fleece coming off of that. But back then it was about 5 pounds. It also talked about, a lot of the chapter was on breaking down exactly how big the flocks were, who had the biggest flocks. Of course, the royal households had big flocks. Monasteries had big flocks, but they were decimated by the Napoleonic Wars, and that means there was lost genetics when that happened as well. So that is it for shearing the flocks. There's not too many pictures in here. Like I said, a lot of it has to do with, how many. I wish there were more shearing photos. That might be here. So here's that washing the fleece. Here's total number of flocks. So, if you're really interested in that, you can borrow this book. Yep. So that is about it. There are other parts of the book I don't think are really relevant. I'm going to read that. If I find anything in here that I think is really relevant to modern hand shepherds or hand spinners, whatever, I will let you know. But as far as wool production, I just wanted to share that with you. So thank you for joining me on Spinning the Past, and I'll see you next time.